Hi, welcome again. Sorry it's been a little while, just life gets in the way of things. We're going to do something that's quite interesting today. I think it's a quite interesting one. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident with the hikers in Soviet Russia, 1959. Now basically in January of 1959 we had 9 young Soviet hikers died under mysterious circumstances while trekking through the Ural Mountains in what is now known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. I'm not going to go right into it, everything that happened. There are plenty of videos, plenty of websites, plenty of information on all the different situations that happened, but I will go through some of the facts, and like I've said before, I'm going to give you what I believe is the answer as to what happened, but as usual, make your own mind up. So the 23-year-old hiker named Igor Dyatlov led a journey to reach the peak of Ortatin, a mountain in the northern Urals of Soviet Russia. The young man brought a team of 9 experienced hikers, many from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, along with him for the adventure. Before he left, Dyatlov had told his sports club that he and his team would send them a telegram as soon as they returned. They stopped off at a Mansi village on the way. The Mansi knew the area well and advised them not to go to the pass. Apparently some of the Mansi reindeer and livestock and deer had been killed previously. That's a fact. Dyatlov now apparently had a disagreement with one of them, and that's according to Yuri, who left the group at the Mansi village because he was ill. Now he couldn't continue and the rest of the group carried on to the pass. So we've got photos of their journey, a tent set up in the woods, the stove which would be their lifelines, and photos of the tree line on the way. And one photo in particular which is very telling. Now that's this one. It's quite blurry, and some have said this is one of the group, others have said this is Yeti, or a mink as the locals call it. As with any photo, it's down to you to make your own mind up as to what your eyes are seeing. Now we're going to go to the final night. This is where everything gets strange. Now I believe that the night before there had been an encounter. Now you see a photo of one of the group with a burnt jacket. Nobody quite knows why this got burnt, why this got set on fire. There's every possibility it simply was left by the campfire and ended up getting caught alight, and it's just one of those things that happens on these things. Could be that they set fire to it for some reason. There's all sorts of speculation, but I don't think for the sake of this it's massively important, but I still think it's quite interesting. Now the team set up their tent up in the storm on the side of a hill. We can see the picture here and it doesn't look exactly perfect. Now this was a very unusual place to put a tent, simply because that putting a tent in that kind of conditions especially would have made much more sense in the cover of the forest, and it puzzled the rescuers as to why the tent was there. Little known fact as well is the group had placed rations in another part of the tree line. This was likely to save weight on the trip to the pass they would collect on the way back. This wasn't completely unusual because you don't want to be carrying all your possessions all the way up and all the way down. But this is an important thing for what happened later. So we'll look at what we know for a fact happened. Now this is documented, no speculation. So the group set up the tent on the hillside in a storm. They didn't use the stove that night, even though the temperatures were well below freezing. They used the stove every other night, but not this night, and they'd only taken up 1 log, so they had no real intention of using the stove either, which was very strange. You expect them to use the stove. My speculation is they didn't use the stove because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. There is some evidence for this. Now they'd cut eye holes in the tent from the inside. Now remember how cold this was. This was -20, -30 in some cases. It was freezing and they didn't have a stove and they're cutting holes in their tent. This was before they cut the tent from the inside to run. They were cutting the tent with eye holes to see out. Now you can see that from the picture here. Now something had obviously scared them so much that they cut the tent from the inside to run out into the night. Now this was their only tent, their only form of shelter. Yes, they had sewing equipment. Yes, they could have cut it and run back out. They ran out in their underclothes and some without their boots. They were experienced and they knew this was almost certainly going to mean death. The group ran to the forest edge, which was about a mile away, and not to their supplies, which would have made far more sense for them to have run to their supplies. This indicates that they simply ran. No thoughts, just ran. What was the point of having supplies to go to if you don't go to them? Now they reached a cedar tree about a mile away, and started a fire. Two of the group tried to climb the tree, and some indications are that the upper branches were set fire to. These two were both found dead at the base of the tree. Now, one had bitten his frostbitten knuckle off. They had some of their clothes taken by a few of the other group as well. Their fingers, their toes, they were basically frostbitten. This was at the time of death as well, so this wasn't afterwards. So he would have had to have lost his fingers and his toes. They were in a bit of a dreadful state. Three of the group had tried to crawl back to the tent, but they didn't retrace their steps that they'd run to, because they obviously knew that the tent was their lifeline, so they tried to crawl back to the tent via another route from where they'd come. Now, that would have been easier to do that, to retrace their steps, but why? Now, those three died of hypothermia and didn't make it back. The other four were found near a ravine, a short way into the forest, about 20-30 metres from the actual cedar tree. They'd built a snow cave. They'd moved away from the cedar tree, which they had started a fire under. So again, why did they move away from their fire, which would have given them some warmth and some chance of survival? But they did manage to build a snow cave. So they dug in deep, and that was done pretty quickly. Now, all of those that they were found on May the 5th. Now, considering this happened on about February the 5th, February the 6th, it was about 3 months after that these bodies were found, and these three had suffered the worst injuries. We got Lyudmila Dubinina had her tongue and eyes missing, and two were crushed to death. Another had his skull caved in. Semyon Zolotaryev appeared to have been the last to die, crushed to death in an embrace with Kolvatov, who had a broken nose but had died of hypothermia. Semyon Zolotarev was a World War II veteran, and at 35 was the oldest of the group. He had apparently told some people on the train to the hike they would be set famous after the hike. We'll call this speculation, but it's worth mentioning. Now, Semyon was also found with a fifth camera that apparently was like a secret camera he'd kept secret from the group. He was also found with a pen and paper in hand. Now, he ran from the tent without much clothing, but he kept the camera and he kept the pen and paper. So why? He was found with a pen and paper in his hand when he died, but I'll go through that in a bit. So what happened? Basically, having scoured a few websites and seen a lot of videos of the incident, there is only one thing that makes sense. And as much as it doesn't make sense, it was basically a menk. The Mansi know it was a menk, and I absolutely believe that the Russian government know it was a menk. Now, basically, if we take into everything that happened that night, we can ascertain that the only thing that counts for all the actions is Yeti. Now, we have to put aside right now as to whether you believe it exists or don't believe it exists. But let's have a look at all the actions. We've got the photo taken before they camped out on the hillside. Now, some people suggest it's a hiker. I don't believe it is. I actually do believe that is the menk that killed them. I'm not saying 100% it is. It could be another hiker on his way back. It just doesn't look like one. Then we've got the actions of them building the tent by the hillside, which again, if they were being stalked in the forest by a menk, it would make absolute sense for them to build a tent by the hillside and cut ice slits into the tent to give them a view of the forest from both forest edges, plus have supplies to run back to if needed, which they did need, but they didn't think about it at the time. So we got the stove that wasn't used. Now, this is also telling they knew not to use the stove even though temperatures were well below freezing. This suggests that they knew not to attract attention to the tent. Again, this makes perfect sense. Why be cooking food and all that kind of thing, which is probably one of the reasons they suspected they may be attracting the menk. We've also got a little known fact here. A ski pole had been attempted to be cut with a knife. Now, the rescuers found a ski pole with knife marks, and no one travelling through deep snow on skis would cut their ski pole for fun. Now, I'm fairly sure that they were trying to make a weapon, and the ski pole was the last resort, and it would have been sturdier than cutting wooden sticks. I think that they spotted the menk and they frantically started trying to make a weapon. Again, one of the theories is that it was rockets, and I know the Russians can be a bit crazy, but even the Russians don't go firing rockets over mountains that aren't testing sites. That's a ludicrous idea to me. But nor do you cut eye holes into the tent looking out for supposedly rockets, and then when something does go off, then you're suddenly frightened by it. None of that really makes sense to me. So they basically cut the tent from the inside and run. Now, this is one of the most famous acts of what they did. It is a desperate act of a last resort, and they know that they're going to go out there and die. These are experienced hikers. They know what they're doing. So they just literally cut and run. That's only suggesting to me that the only option was not to go out the front of the tent. My view is that the menk was on the outside of the tent, and it was, well, either stamping on the tent, At some point it's grabbed Igor Dyatlov. He's found with marks around his ankles, which some have suggested he may be tied by a rope or something, which again doesn't really make sense if you consider that there was no evidence of any rope or ties or the fact he was running away. Now, a few of the group have been found with bruises on their fists like they've been fighting. So what I'm speculating is that at some point the Menk has got hold of Igor and that they've just attacked the Menk with all their might. This is a fight for their life. When I sort of think of the situation, it's quite a scary situation I believe they were in. I know last time we did Jack the Ripper, put it this way, I think this is a scarier situation. So they ran out in their underclothes. This means they didn't see the danger coming up the hill. Otherwise I think they'd have been prepared a bit more. Either that or the danger was running at them very fast when they did see it. Now we're going to play what is supposedly a Bigfoot screaming. Now you can imagine this literally yards from your tent. And I think we'd all agree that cutting a tent from the inside and scarpering is probably a good idea.
What that is? I don't know. It's scary. Everyone else is hearing it too.
Now, again, as we've mentioned, some of the injuries point to a fight. Igor Dyatlov and a couple of others had bruises on their knuckles, and the Yeti grabbed them, but the Yeti was simply too powerful. Now, if you look at the tent and the fact it's collapsed, now, obviously they cut the tent and they made a bit of a mess of it, so to say it was squashed by another force or something is difficult, but to me, it does look like the whole area is a bit of a shambles. Lots of stuff's gone on there. Now, rescuers who come to the tent and everything else, so whose footprints are what, it's hard to tell. There had also been winds blowing the snow and creating probably a bit more of a mess. Now, two of the bodies that have been found under the tree had climbed the tree. Now, it appears that they've set fire to the upper branches. Now, this to me makes sense. If you want to either attract attention or cause a big kerfuffle to scare away a predator, you want to make a big fire. And setting fire to a whole tree, to me, makes a whole lot of sense. You've got various benefits to this. One is some warmth. Another one, that big fires scare away predators. Bears, wolves, all that kind of thing, lions. So therefore, why not a Yeti? Also, you can use it as a signal as well. Whether or not anyone would see it that far out, I simply don't know. I mean, there was Mansi around, but my feelings is that they've tried to set fire to it to scare away what was attacking them. Also, another thing to remember is these guys actually made a fire. So this thing of paradoxical undressing, or it was an avalanche, or they were out of their minds, the scared witless, that doesn't make any sense. These guys had enough wits about them to make a fire. They weren't just crazily running about completely and utterly off their heads. We sort of see a theory where they've taken magic mushrooms or LSD and they've been part of an experiment, or the Russian armies attacked them, or the Mansi have attacked them, and God knows what else, even the CIA, so on and so forth. None of that makes sense, especially when you consider that they had the nous about them to start a fire and try and keep warm, first and foremost, I would assume. Certainly as someone who had found with burns on their hands and their legs, certainly the two under the tree, which would be indicative of them trying to warm up their hands by the fire, but they were so cold they couldn't feel anything and burnt themselves. Now, they cut some large branches from the tree as well. Now, this can be still seen today, where they've cut a number of quite large branches, and apparently at the time there was knife marks, so they've sort of sliced through as much as they can and then broken them off. So they couldn't just break them off, they were quite thick branches. It's been a waste of resources to collect this for firewood. Now, there's plenty of firewood around. I think they cut these branches off to use as protection. It's that simple. Which again would make sense. If you're being attacked by a large ape, you want to get yourself as defensible as possible, and cutting and breaking off large branches with a number of you would definitely be the best way to do that. Now, we see some footprints outside the tent. We look at later on where we can see that there's potentially been some kind of a cover-up on this. There have been reports that have been large footprints outside the tent. We see one here which looks like a strange footprint, but it doesn't look overly large if we look at the shoe beside it. So I'm sort of open-minded about this at the moment. I'm not sure. I think there could have been a lot more photographs, but again, we'll see. And the last of the bodies were the ones that had the worst injuries. The Yeti found them. All these guys had quite a lot of injuries: crushed rib cages, broken skulls. One appeared to have been thrown. Lyudmila looks like her body's been thrown against the rock. How she died was supposedly hypothermia. Rather unpleasantly, she had her tongue and the base of her tongue muscle missing. Now, her face was face down in water. Now, that could have creased her tongue and eyes with the water going over her face, but to me her body just doesn't look natural. It sort of fell there in death. It looks to me like it's been thrown there. So this is from a rescuer, member of the search party, and this is from Vladimir Ashkenazy. Now, he records that he dug them out of the body. One of the bodies, Zolotaryov, had a notebook in one hand and a pencil in the other. Colonel Otyokov grabbed the notepad, looked at it and cursed and said, "He's written nothing." Now, he seems to be the only one that has seen the notepad. The whereabouts of the notepad is unknown. It was never filed as evidence or seen by anyone else. On the other hand, we only know from Ashkenazy about the whole episode with the pen, notepad, and Colonel Otyokov, and 59 years after the fact, in a recent letter Ashkenazy to Ural Pathfinder magazine. So Georgy Otyokov, the army colonel in charge of the logistics and helicopter support, was the only one who saw the notebook in Zolotaryov's hand. Vladimir Ashkenazy recalls that it was hard to identify the bodies as they found them, and it was Colonel Otyokov who was ordaining who was who. Now remember, if we see one or two of these bodies, they were quite in a bad shape, and sort of identifying them immediately was surprising. So he says, "We were surprised." Ashkenazy said because it was really hard to see and no one could object or disagree. Ashkenazy also mentioned that while he was present during that period, he felt very strongly that those in charge were not really interested in a proper investigation. He remembers that the lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, did not approach the pad of the branches, didn't take pictures. It seemed they already had a theory. Ashkenazy extends this accusation to Otyokov, who was in charge of the whole rescue operation. He wrote, "If it was really so important to get this right, why didn't they call for Yuri Yudin? He was the only one that knew them all and could say for sure, I only knew Zina." So Yuri Yudin was the one that had left the group at the Mansi village. They didn't call for him. They didn't call for Yuri Yudin to identify the bodies as they were being pulled out. They seemed to just know who was who. So the whole search operation was rushed. The pressure was from someone above, from Moscow. Otyokov and some soldiers took all the bodies from the stream, carried them to the bank and placed them on special stretchers to drag them across the snow. They took them to the pass to the helipad. It was hard work and they repeated the same process 4 times. A helicopter met them on the pass, but the pilots refused to take the bodies on board, complaining that this was outside their official duties. It has been said that the pilots knew the bodies were poisoned with radiation and for this reason didn't want them in the aircraft. Otyokov sent the following radiogram: "This is a scandal. I and 14 other people brought these bodies on our shoulders and they refused to take the bodies in spite of me insisting. As a communist, I am outraged by the behaviour of the crew and you asked me to inform the Communist Party leader about it. I have to mention to you for clarity that these bodies are frozen. We packed them for transportation. There was no reason to refuse to take them. The medical expert refused to examine or to cut the bodies here on site. It is absolutely not dangerous from the point of hygiene. They are folded and covered in special impervious material. The crew said they would not transport them until they were in zinc coffins." At this point, Colonel Otyokov reached the limits of his desperation. He took out the pistol and threatened the crew, apparently. Vladimir Ashkenazy intervened, after which the medical expert reorganized how the bodies should be packed for transportation and they were finally airlifted transportation to Ivdel. So here we see sort of various different things here. Now, Yuri Yudin mentioned that there was an army gaiter found at the site, and he said absolutely no one in the crew that he was with, no one in the party had anything like a Soviet military gaiter. A gaiter is one of those things that you put around the bottom of your legs to stop things like the snow getting into your boots, which is completely normal, but they found a Soviet military one. So I'm fairly sure that the military knew what was going on, and I believe that the military had been there beforehand. Whether they'd done anything with the bodies, there is some speculation that the bodies have been turned over or moved. I don't know this, but what I do know is that I'm fairly sure that what attacked them was a Yeti. I'm fairly sure that the Russian government know there's a Yeti. I'm fairly sure that the Mansi in the village knew it was a Yeti, or a Menk as they call it. And we see in the video some of the Russians, alluring to this, that they were attacked. and there doesn't seem to be much dispute that they were attacked. It's just what they were attacked by and who.
Мы сразу можем исключать смерть в результате действия лавины, смерть в результате взрыва. Сразу можем исключать действие химического оружия, радиационного оружия, действия электромагнитных, освещений, излучений и так далее. Версию нападения диких животных, медведи, росомахи и так далее. Нету повреждений, характерных для действия животных. Скорее всего, вот такая хаотичность повреждений, можно сказать, да, разнородность, как раз свидетельствует о том, что не было одного какого-то предмета, да, которым последовательно бы причинялись повреждения всем погибшим. Резюмируя, можно утверждать, что на них напал кто-то, у кого не было огнестрельного оружия, по крайней мере, не использовал, у кого не было колюще-режущих предметов, по крайней мере, не использовал, а все повреждения наносились исключительно тупыми твердыми предметами. Скорее всего, это все-таки дело рук человека.
It doesn't make any sense that it was other humans. It was just too much of a compelling force. If we look at some of the injuries, we did have some injuries on one of the group that was found at the bottom of the tree, who does, if we look at a couple of the others who had crushed ribs, they said that the impact was like being hit by a car. That's quite an impact. Now here we look at sort of, do we believe in Yetis? Do we believe in Bigfoot? Well, if we look at some of the David Paulides investigation, he's actually collected hair samples which have been tested by laboratories and proved to have been from an unknown origin. It seems like an indisputable point from my point of view that these things exist. Now, why don't we have bodies? Why don't we have dung? Why don't we have this? Now this is where it gets interesting, because they do appear to be extra dimensional. It sounds convenient that they can appear and disappear, but this has been witnessed. Psychologists, by psychiatric people and so on and so forth, there have been expeditions to go out looking for Bigfoot, for Yetis, by the army, by the governments. Now, something that I found researching this a bit actually is that there's a Mansi legend that Bigfoot survived from thousands of years ago when God sent the floods to punish them. And now these could be the Nephilim of the past that's talked about. The Native American Indians even talk about them being a different race of humanoids, and in some cases, from what I understand, potentially even traded with them. So it does make sense that these things do exist. How and why, in what dimension, I don't know. There have been reports of sightings with lights, and we see from one of the photos that they've got pictures of lights. Now, whether this was part of a fire, whether this was a flare that they may have had, whether this was something else, I don't know. No one seems to know what this is, and I don't know either. But I am as sure as I can be this was a Yeti. I don't see any other explanation for all of their actions. Every single one of their actions, if you consider that it was basically a monster chasing them, that makes perfect sense. Every single one of their actions, they were trying to get back to the tent while some of them hid in a small ravine. They did exactly what I think I would do in that situation, or at least I'd hope I'd do. I think these were brave men and women. I think they went through a hell of an ordeal and they dealt with it as best as they possibly could. And every single one of their actions was actually admirable, very admirable and brave. So the Dyatlov Pass seems to be an anomaly in itself. There's been reports of planes and helicopters going down around there. It's now a no-fly zone simply because it's an anomaly. Now that's another thing, is whether we portals into other dimensions or areas of the world where strange things happen, which I believe is to do with mountainous regions and ley lines that go through mountains and get disrupted like energy lines. It's a strange world we live in, that's for certain. I've seen, like with the Mandela effect, we've seen some very, very strange stuff, and as strange as this might be to think it's a Yeti, one of the things that points to the fact that I think a lot of people do know it's a Yeti is how ridiculed that theory is. People say, well, it could be UFOs, it could be this, it could be that, it could be fairies and God knows what else. And as soon as you come to a Yeti, it's like, this strange and ludicrous, this theory as to what it was. That's a perfect example as to when people kind of trying to put you off what things actually are, they'll belittle it and ridicule it as much as possible. Well, they can or they like, but there is only one thing that makes sense for absolutely every single one of their actions, and that is Yeti, regardless of whether you believe it or not. So, I hope you've enjoyed it. Spare a thought for these guys, what happened to them. because out of everything I've ever researched and everything I've ever looked at, I'd say it was quite terrifying that night, and glad everyone's resting in peace now. Anyway, good luck.